All right, good afternoon and welcome back to day 3, our last day of Fiscal Basics. This is Bonnie McFarland, and we'll be continuing on and finishing up our last section today. And as usual, our slides and the recording will be posted on our website, and I believe Evan put the link in there on the slide. So I think we got all the questions from yesterday, so we're going to move ahead on day 3. And last time we looked at some other, well, let's look at the questions first. The next slide, I believe, just as a reminder before we go ahead, put any questions you have in the chat. If we have time, we'll try and respond. If not, we'll send them out in writing to you. So far, we've done pretty well, been able to either answer questions or you haven't had any. So let's take a look at what we're going to look at today. So on day 1, we looked at leveraging resources, knowing how program and fiscal requirements are important for using funds effectively and leveraging funds for student success. Day 2, we looked at basic concepts, terminology needed to understand federal requirements. We looked at the Uniform Grants Guidance and particularly the cost principles. And now today we're going to be looking at internal controls. We're going to look at reporting requirements, and we're going to end up with policies and procedures. And we're also going to, one of those policies and procedures has to do with time and effort reporting. So we'll be looking at that too. All right, so let's get started. And first we're going to look at fiscal reporting, and 4 areas we're going to look at: the consolidated application, federal cash management reporting, reporting on federal interest earned and the requirements surrounding that, and then finally comparability requirements. And some of these lie more in the fiscal office, and some of them are very much a joint effort. So, but they're important for everyone to understand the role in each. So starting out, we'll take a look at the consolidated application. So first question is, what is a consolidated application? Many of you are familiar with it, you work with it, and it's coming up soon. But for some of you, this is going to be fairly new. So the consolidated application is actually the document that the California Department of Education uses to distribute categorical funds from various programs to either to county offices, to school districts, and to charter schools also. And it's called a consolidated application because it allows LEAs to submit one application for multiple programs as opposed to applying for each one individually. Currently, only ESSA formula grants are included in the consolidated application. In the past, when we had state categoricals, those were included, but now only ESSA programs are included. The application also includes legal assurances, and these are assurances. Some of them are general assurances and some of them are related to specific programs, but there are assurances that the LEA has to agree to in order to receive the funds. The CONAP is primarily a fiscal document. It does have program implications, and it's a companion document to the LCAP Federal Addendum. And the LCAP Federal Addendum includes narrative responses about how the LEA is carrying out federal program requirements. The consolidated application includes primarily fiscal, but also some program reporting on those areas. Okay, next slide, we're going to look at how it operates. It comes in 2 data collections. There's one in June. It's called the spring submission, and the winter data collection is done in February, due on February 28th. And it includes fiscal reporting for multiple years. So it's important to keep in mind that you have to keep your fiscal years separate. Sometimes we've had new fiscal folks who don't understand the importance of maintaining separate, distinct reporting categories for each year of the grant, because you're reporting going back since we talked about yesterday. Federal funds have a 27-month timeline for spending them. Therefore, you have funds back 3 years that you're still reporting on. So you report on, for Title III, actually it has the most reporting. You're reporting 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. You also report in a closeout report when it's coming at the end of the grant to show that you've spent all the money. For Title I, the consolidated application also includes your school level allocations. That's where you report funds that are allocated to schools. It's also where you report funds reserved for district reservations. And in addition, there's a carryover report to report how much carryover relative to the 15% carryover maximum. Also included in the application are some authorizations for federal transferability and consolidation of administrative costs. You can apply for those through the CONAP. We'll touch on those briefly a little bit later. It's important to know, and we'll look on the next slide, it'll be a reminder that the consolidated application is primarily an after the fact reporting, and this is especially true in the winter submission. It's particularly important because decisions that are reported should have been made earlier in the year. What we find sometimes, especially if someone's relatively new, they get like you have to complete the consolidated application. And there's information in there and they feel like it's time for them to be making this, oh, I have to decide on these things now. No, these are reports on decisions that should have been made because your programs by February, your programs have been in operation for more than half the year. So those decisions should have been made. Here's a few examples of those decisions that you make early and report in the winter CONAP. One is your Title I school allocations. Those are reported in the winter submission, how much money went to each school. Notice it's past tense, went, because schools should be ranked for Title I at the beginning of the year. The funds should go out to them based on initial estimates and updated periodically, and then that's reported in the application. Also, LEA reservation of funds. You should have made those reservations because those are for services that should be taking place during the year. So you're not making a decision about, are you going to reserve funds in February? Those should have been made already. Next one's federal transferability, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's transferring funds among programs. And when you do that, those funds should have been transferred so the receiving program can use those funds to operate during the year. There's also a requirement, consolidation of administrative costs is included in there, and that's something that you need to be thinking about, whether you want to consolidate administrative costs for administrators to reduce the time and effort burden, and then also carryover reporting. And it's important to know this is after the fact because for Title I, the excess carryover is reported in February, but it had to be spent by September 30th. So you need to either have a plan in place and cross your fingers that you get a waiver. And because the waiver is not automatic, other than this year, we anticipate anyone who needs a waiver will get one. But in a typical year, that waiver, it's only available once every 3 years, and it's possible for some reason that it could be denied. So you need to be aware of that. You're taking a risk because you're reporting on how much carryover you had, not how much you will have. So just some important reminders that this is all reporting after the fact. All right, so let's take a look at another system. This tends to be primarily in the fiscal office, this reporting, and a lot of times program people aren't aware of it, but it can cause some issues on both sides of the house, and that's federal cash management. Federal cash management's purpose is to ensure that LEAs are drawing down funds as they need it. Okay? Federal law requires that LEAs don't pull down all their funds and then put them in the bank because you can't maintain accrue, I guess is the word, interest on federal funds. So the purpose of cash management is to ensure that funds are being spent in a timely manner. It requires quarterly reporting on expenditures for the federal programs listed there. So you'll notice it's primarily federal formula grant programs. On occasion, CDE can utilize the CMDC system for special data collections. When we got some of the CARES money and some of the other funds, there was conversation about whether or not they would use CMDC, which is the cash management system, for reporting on that. But cash balances, the reason they're reported is the cash balances that show in the cash management system that you report quarterly are used to determine your subsequent apportionment. So at the beginning of the year, schools get an apportionment and then they report what they've spent. The apportionment you get, it has to be equal to at least 25% of your annual entitlement minus what's reported in the cash balance for that period. So essentially you need to be spending down at least 25% of your total entitlement every quarter. If that doesn't happen, your next apportionment will be reduced by the amount that you underspent. Now, it doesn't affect your total annual entitlement. That money is still available to you. It still belongs to the district, but it does delay the timeline for you receiving those funds. So important to notice. And it should, what's reported in CMDC should align with what you report in the CONAP. It raises questions when someone looks at the CONAP and they see a certain amount reported as expended, and yet the cash management reports don't match. So it's important to connect those two, and there should be systems in your office to be looking to see, are we on target for both of those? One important thing to keep in mind is that this kind of rubber hits the road in terms of cash flow. If you're not reporting, then those funds, and you're not reporting that you're spending it down, then funds aren't flowing to your LEA as they should. So if you see that you're not getting your apportionments of certain program funds, you need to check and make sure it's reported. Sometimes it's not that you haven't spent it, but it's that you haven't reported it. So this sometimes causes, if you're not communicating, it causes some confusion with program and fiscal offices, because I've heard program offices tell me, I thought we were spending all the money. And they hear from the fiscal offices saying, we're not getting our apportionments, reflecting we're not spending the money. So somewhere there's some misalignment, and that needs to be figured out. So your program expenditures, are they being documented appropriately so they're going to the right fund? What's happening that's causing that hang up in getting your apportionments? So CMDC is important for that reason, and it's only for your formula grants that are funded that are not on a reimbursement schedule. Some programs are on a reimbursement schedule. You have to spend the money and then request reimbursement. The formula title programs you see there are not that way. You get funds at the beginning of the year to work on, and then you get more funds when you've spent them down. All right, so the next slide gives you the reporting dates. These are usually pretty standard. So you can see the quarterly dates. There's a date you can start reporting, and then there's a final deadline date. You can start reporting early, but good to check the deadline date to make sure you've captured all your expenditures. And you'll see the link here where you can find all the instructions and information for cash management reporting. All right, the next reporting is connected to federal cash management, and that's your federal interest earned reporting. Okay? And this is required, again, there's those CFR numbers 200, okay? So you can see it's in the Code of Federal Regulations, the Uniform Grants Guidance. So interest earned up to $500 a year can be retained by the non-federal entity, that's you. Whenever you see non-federal entity, that is either you or the CDE. It can be kept for administrative purposes, but it's important to keep in mind that that amount applies to all your federal grants. It's not by grant. So it's $500 in total, so it's really not that much. The intent is that the funds that districts or any entity should not be making money off their federal grants. So any additional interest earned on federal advance payments has to be deposited in an account and has to be remitted back to the U.S. Treasury annually. Federal interest earned is reported again on a quarterly basis. Let's look a little more at interest and some of the requirements. So again, we said it's in the Code of Federal Regulation and where this requirement is. And as I said, the interest is only calculated for funds received in advance, not reimbursement, not on a reimbursement basis. If you go to the CDE website, you'll see a long list of other grants that do not require cash management reporting. And that's sort of good news, bad news is the good news, you don't have to do the report. The bad news is you don't receive advance payments. You're on a reimbursement schedule. And again, you're reporting it quarterly. And when you're then the instructions, these are the instructions, you have to remit the payments, include your codes, and submit that on a quarterly basis. So interest earned is, I guess the connection between your reporting and your interest earned. We have some people who are surprised that they can't earn interest on the federal grants. But CMDC was put in place a number of years ago. We didn't used to have this system, and the reason it came about is that the U.S. Department of Education did some audits in California, and they found that many of our districts were holding on to money and not spending it in a timely manner. And so based on that, there were two possibilities as to what could happen with these grants. One was that they could revert to a reimbursement schedule, which would have meant that you're not getting money, you're working off your own money to start with, and then you get reimbursed. Or we do the cash management, and the cash management obviously was the lesser of the two evils. And so that is how we're operating now, is under the cash management. Okay. All right, and finally, I think we have comparability. And comparability reporting has undergone a few changes in the last few years, but the requirements itself haven't changed, and the purpose of it hasn't changed. It is primarily based on for Title I programs, but it's required that an LEA can only receive Title I funds for schools if it's used to provide services that are at least, if the LEA provides services that taken as a whole are at least comparable to services in schools that aren't receiving Title I funds. So what it means is you're not underfunding your Title I schools and having them use Title I funds to make up the difference. Each LEA has to demonstrate comparability annually, and they have to show that all their schools are providing comparable services with state and local funds. So that's the floor. And the LEA can't discriminate, you'll notice it, either intentionally or unintentionally against any Title I funded school just because they received those federal funds. So it's another safeguard to ensure that Title I funds, again, we talked about supplement, not supplant. Well, this really is a piece of that, that comparability shows that those funds are supplemental to state and local funds. Comparability reporting, as I believe it mentioned earlier, is required as a condition of receipt of funds. And that's why the calculations need to be done early in the year. So you need to show comparability for services in Title I and non-Title I schools. And now a change in the last couple of years has been that you can only use student-teacher ratio. You used to have several options to student-teacher salary ratio was another option, but now most recently they've limited it to student-teacher ratio. It also requires that the LEA have a policy to show that you're distributing materials and supplies in an equitable manner, and that you have procedures for determining that on an annual basis. If a district or an LEA, usually it's a school district, because if you only have one school, you don't need to meet comparability because you only have one school. You can't be comparable to other schools. So most charter schools, this isn't applicable, and have never seen a case where it's applicable to charter schools to this date. So any discrepancies, however, need to be corrected in order to be eligible to receive the funding. So if you do a comparability report and you find that your schools are not comparable, then you need to make adjustments to ensure that comparability is met. And essentially that's supposed to be prior to receiving the funds, but funds could be recalled if you don't meet it. So basically the message from the department is make sure you meet it, make whatever changes you need to do. In the past, these reports were submitted every other year to CDE, but in the last few years, they've not required submission, but the report does have to be completed annually and maintained at the LEA in the district office. In addition, LEAs have to have policies and procedures for annually demonstrating comparability. So how do you do this? Who does it? That should be somewhere in your policies and procedures. And that also helps for a new person coming in to, oh, this is how we do our comparability reports. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on. We got some of those reporting things out of the way. Let's move on to looking at internal controls. We've mentioned this. You've heard the term come up throughout the last couple of days, and now we're going to kind of delve into it and see what that means, because internal controls are really foundational to the Uniform Grants Guidance, and they really show the philosophy and the point of view of the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of the Inspector General, toward looking at how districts control their funds. So it's a fiscal, primarily we think of internal controls, you're going to see a lot of fiscal references, but also note that you're going to see mentioned achieving program objectives, because it's not just about the money, it's about, do you have controls in place to ensure that you're achieving what the district wants to achieve in terms of programs for students. So let's take a look at the purpose. And the purpose of the internal controls is to ensure that the agency meets your program objectives. There's that terminology again about program objectives, and implements programs in compliance. So it's compliance and program outcomes, and with legal requirements for assessing potential risks for the LEA to implementing district systems. So it has to do with determining where your risks are and ensuring that you have systems in place to prevent, detect, and correct instances of waste, fraud, or abuse. So the real focus here is on what are you doing to prevent it? Once you detect that there's a problem, what do you do? And then if you've had a problem and it caused an issue that resulted in misuse of funds, then how do you correct that? So that's what internal controls are essentially about. Here's what the Uniform Grants Guidance says about it. It says that you need to establish and maintain. So it's clearly stated that you have to maintain internal controls, and the controls need to provide reasonable assurance that you're managing your award in compliance with, first of all, and we've said this a number of times, the statute, regulations, and terms and conditions of the award. So whatever the program is, you're meeting its requirements. Internal controls should be in place to ensure that. They should also be in compliance with the guidance for the standards for internal control in the federal government. They specifically reference this document in the Uniform Grants Guidance, and we're going to take a look at some information and what's in that, because you'll find what's in the grants guidance gives you a general idea, but these standards for internal control actually give you questions to ask processes, what it should look like in practice. Right. All right, so internal controls also require, again, here's that complying with all legal requirements, but they also require that the entity, the local education agency, evaluate and monitor your compliance with statutes, rules, and conditions. So how are you evaluating and how are you monitoring that? And then take prompt action when instances of non-compliance are identified. And including non-compliance identified in audit findings. So when you receive an audit, internal controls would dictate that you should take those audit findings and look at them and say, how are we going to take action to correct whatever was found in the audit? Okay. And then also there's a requirement in there to take measures to protect personally identifiable information. That's something that's become important recently. So these are the basic requirements, but let's look at what we see in terms of some of the details. Okay. right, so the internal recalls actually focus on the LEA's procedures. And those are procedures to ensure that programs are implemented appropriately. And the standards for internal control reference these 5 interrelated components. All right. And first is a control environment. And then a risk assessment should take place. And that should lead to control activities. And then the standards address information and communication and how that plays a part in maintaining compliant programs. And then finally, monitoring. So we're going to take a look at the first area, control environment. Now, control environment is based on the attitude of management toward internal control. So what's attitude? How does management behave? And it forms the basis for all the other elements. It's foundational. It sets the tone of the organization and it influences the control consciousness of people. In other words, are people really aware that there are some requirements here and we need to be meeting them? And as I said, it's foundational for the other components, and it provides discipline and a structure. And while it's the most important one, and I said foundational, it's also the hardest to impact. And I know sometimes when we talk about this, people's eyes kind of glaze over like, what can I do about it? Okay, well, there are things, everyone has an ability to make an impact at some place. And I say even though it's hardest to impact, maybe the impact is when good people like you out there are in positions of power and set that positive control environment. But it's also, I would say, the biggest reason why organizations lose good people, because it's not comfortable to work in an environment where there's not a respect for the programs that are being implemented, for the laws that are required. If people feel that what they're doing is not ethical, is not in keeping with what's required, then the best people usually leave those programs. And so it behooves leaders to have a good control environment, not only for program purposes, but for maintaining the quality of the people who will then ensure that you have those good programs. So it really it's critical. So the standards on the next page for the internal controls that are referenced in the law talk about something called the tone at the top. And I think that's a great term for what internal control and the control environment is. And what that means is that management demonstrates the importance of integrity and ethical values through everything they do. Their directives, when you read what they say, are they ethical? Through their attitudes and their behavior. And also that they lead by example and that they demonstrate the organization's value, philosophy, and operating style, what we call walking the talk. And they'll sound like fluffy terms, but you know how important they are. And obviously, if they made it into federal law, they're important. The oversight body also should be setting a tone throughout the organization and by their example because it's fundamental to the effective system. And then their directives, their attitudes, behaviors should demonstrate what's expected. This is how we expect people to behave. And the oversight body needs to reinforce the commitment to doing what's right, not just maintaining the minimum level of performance necessary to comply with applicable laws. This is something we see playing out, that people say, oh, and all anybody cares about is compliance. And that's because it becomes seen as the basic, the bottom. That's all we have to do. And no, compliance is just the start. Okay? And good internal controls show that that's a minimum. That's what we expect of everyone. But we're going to go way beyond that and focus on positive outcomes. So this is the kind of place where this is how we behave here. You don't see wink, wink, nod, nod going along and like you're feeling pressured to do things you shouldn't. In that kind of an organization, immediately this poor tone at the top and a poor internal controls starting at the very top of the organization. And that's important. So next, the next step, that's kind of the basis. The next step, and it's really kind of the beginning, is the risk assessment. So a risk assessment is the agency's identification and analysis of risks relative to, again, here you see achievement of the objectives, and it forms the basis of how risks should be managed. So it all starts with thinking about what risks are there and that's number one. Are you aware of them? And it says, given the dynamic nature of governmental organizations, you need to anticipate and mitigate risk. And it's a key factor in measuring the strengths of an organization. So step one is awareness. So think about that, particularly that second one, it says about the dynamic nature of operating environments. Think about COVID. What's changed in the last year? What things would you never have thought of before that now are certainly could be risks? Think about your own organization and what that environment looks like and how that's led to risky behaviors possibly, or openings for waste, fraud, abuse, things that could happen that wouldn't happen under normal circumstances. So COVID is a huge risk, just beyond physical risk, but to your organization in terms of a risk assessment, this is definitely a time that you should be considering what risks are there. And then the standards for internal control also give us some guidance here and talk about some ways that, some principles for risk assessment. And they start with management defining clear objectives to enable the identification of risk and the tolerance for risk. Okay? So there's always risk, but the question is, what are our outcomes and what are the things that could really get in the way, and what tolerance do we have? Sometimes, things would come to a standstill if you tried to move forward without any risk, but you're trying to mitigate that risk. And if you don't know where you're going, how do you know what the risks are to getting there? So management you should identify, analyze, and respond to risks, to your objectives. Consider the potential for fraud when identifying, analyzing, and responding to risk. What is it that could lead to fraudulent activities? And we'll see some things as we look into control activities that you can do to minimize the risk of fraud. It's amazing how many stories the Office of Inspector General has about instances of fraud by nice little people in agencies that just have access to information or data or funds that are potentially harmful to the agency. And then management should identify and respond to changes, again, that impact the system. So what's changing in your system that could make this what we thought we had risks before, but now we have some new risks that we have to deal with. Okay. So once you've identified the risk, the next step is to implement control activities, and that would mitigate the risks. And these are generally in the policies and procedures that you implement. And they help ensure that the directives from management are carried out. So policies are more big policy, what we want to accomplish and what we plan to do, big ideas, but the procedures are the step-by-step. And the control activities are often embedded in your procedures. And they should be based on the analysis of the risk. Okay. So let's look at some examples of control activities. And these are, again, this is from the standards for internal controls. So first one has to do with proper execution of transactions. Okay. So whoops, no, it isn't. The first one is, got out of order. The first one is physical control over vulnerable assets. So what that means is what steps do you have in place to secure and safeguard vulnerable assets? So that would include limiting access to such things, cash. Do you have cash on hand somewhere? How's that maintained? Securities, inventories. How are equipment and materials, how are those safeguarded? Equipment that might be vulnerable to risk or loss or unauthorized use. How do you ensure the appropriate people have access to equipment? We're not going to go into equipment today too much. There's a whole set of requirements on equipment, but there's new language about computing devices in the guidance, and that has to do with the fact that some things that you think of as not meeting the equipment threshold are easy things that walk away easily. So what are your systems for maintaining iPads, or what is it? How do you secure those? And now, backing up, how do you secure those in the current environment? Because that probably looks different than when everyone was in school. The next is segregation of duties. Segregation of duties is critical to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay? Segregating duties and responsibilities among different people reduces that risk. And that means you're separating who authorizes transactions from who processes them, from who records them, for who reviews them, who does all those things. So not one individual controls key aspects of of transaction or events. We've seen instances when cases from the Office of Inspector General have uncovered significant amounts of money that have been funneled to individuals' bank accounts because there was one person who was in charge. They wrote the order, they processed the order, there was no oversight. So separation of duties is an important control activity. Then another control, there's a couple more examples on the next slide. Proper execution of transactions. And this means that transactions are authorized and executed only with whoever has that authority. It's in the scope of the authority. So only this is the principal means of assuring that only valid transactions, transfers or such, that's done by authorized personnel only. And then access to restrictions to and accountability for resources. So how do you limit access to resources and records to authorized individual? And how do you assign and maintain accountability for their custody and use? So, and again, management should compare their resources with the accountability, and this is all again about reducing errors and also fraud or misuse or unauthorized alteration of records. So just a few examples, and I would encourage you to look at and download a copy of the Standards for Internal Control. Have lots of good supports in there. We'll be looking at them a few more. All right, next has to do with information and communication. And information and communication are critical to an effective internal controls. Information needs to be provided to people, and you may have all experienced this sometime, that it needs to be in a form and a time frame that allow people to support them in carrying out their responsibilities. How often have you gotten a memo saying this is due tomorrow, drop everything, okay? That's not giving it to you in a form and a time frame that enables you to carry out your responsibility. Have you gotten memos requiring for you to do something, provide something, and they're not clear? If it's not clear, it gets confusing, different data goes in, people don't know what they're being asked for. So communication needs to be clear and timely. And then senior management needs to deliver a clear message to employees about their role and responsibilities. So that should be, again, that control environment. And employees, bottom line, the last one, should have a means for communicating about the efficiency and effectiveness of systems to upper management. So how does that work in your organization? If you see something that's not working, you may be the one who knows it best. It's not someone 4 levels above you or wherever. They put out a policy, they develop procedures, and then if you're the one implementing it, you know best when it's working and when it isn't. So what's the process for doing that? And do employees feel comfortable in doing that? That makes a good internal control. We talk about communication going up, down, and across the organization. Lots of information comes down the organization, right? It's always raining down on you. But how does it go across the organization? How do you communicate with other people? Particularly, we're talking now fiscal and program, but also how do you communicate up the organization? How do you make things known when you see problems or issues? A good system and good internal controls includes that. All right, next, or Well, we're going to look at some samples again from the standards for internal control, and we're going to look at some methods for selecting methods for communication. And you'll find this in two separate places, but we kind of merged them here from the document because you need to, management needs to select appropriate ways to communicate both internally and externally. And this is just a sample of some of the factors to consider. Who's the audience that you're communicating to? That's going to have to do with the nature of the communication. We talked yesterday about transparency. If you're communicating to parents and stakeholders, that's going to have to be presented differently. You'll have to consider the language and is it clear and comprehensible? The nature of the information, what do you want to communicate? Availability, how are people accessing it? And that's certainly an issue right now, maybe even gotten a little better now that we're focused on getting things out electronically, but we need to make sure, does that mean everyone? Does everyone have access? What about people without computers? Cost, are there costs of something exorbitant? And then the legal requirements. What do you have to require? What do you have to communicate legally? Is there something? We have a lot of parent communications that are based in law. So this just has to do with some ways, some considerations when you're thinking about communicating internally and externally. All right, the next of the areas is monitoring. And that means that internal controls need to include a process to assess the quality of your control system over time. Okay? So ongoing monitoring activities, management, supervisory activities should be done during the normal performance of that manager's responsibility. It should be built into the job of anyone who's supervising. So reviewing your internal control systems, testing your internal control systems. Do they actually work? And because this is the way you'll know you have a good system. All right. We provided for you, as I mentioned yesterday, we have a Fiscal Basics handbook and that you can purchase, and included in that is, this is, I believe it's also available online, but this is a risk assessment checklist and from the standards book, and it takes each of those areas and gives you a checklist to look at and to rate yourself on each of those areas. You can see this is control environment, and it looks at all the areas, and it does that for risk assessment and for all the other areas. And we have that posted on our website. Actually, that's, I'm trying to remember, where can you access it? We posted it with the handouts from this section, so because that's kind of a handy tool if you want to delve into this area of risk assessment. All right, so looking at internal controls is going to lead us right into the next topic, because internal controls really are based on having policies and procedures in place to support those systems. And they're implemented through LEA policies and procedures. And the Uniform Grants Guidance is heavy on policies and procedures. You'll see there are many policies and procedures that are listed in there that are required for LEAs. And we're just going to look at a handful of them, but I would urge you to delve into the guidance and understand all those. And for some of them, we're not going to go as far in the weeds. I just want you to have sort of an awareness of what those policy and procedures are and what's required. But actually some of them, particularly in the fiscal area, they're really deep when they go into procurement and such and have a lot of detail. So they take you experts to go look at those. So what's the difference? Let's look. Okay. And next slide, I think, is going to help us look at the difference between the two. So what are policies and what are procedures? So policies are more your goals, your formal directives of your organization, and they communicate the big ideas to employees, their outcomes. Policies, we often ask this question and never get a clear yes or no, but it really does depend. They may or may not require board adoption by your governing board. Because these are federal requirements, they really don't address local boards. So most of the policies that definitely require and state that they require board approval are state level policies. So most of the federal policies, it kind of depends on your district practice. It's best to have board approved policies, but CD has indicated that not all of them require. Procedures are different, on the other hand. Those are specific methods employed in the operations daily of your organization to make sure you achieve those policy goals. And they don't require board approval. And part of that reason is that you may be amending those periodically based on the current need, based on your current risk assessment. It's important to remember that your policies and your procedures, it just says procedures here, but really both of them, or neither of them, I should say, should be just a reiteration of the requirements. You're not just saying, when you read the law, it'll tell you, you need to have a policy that says da, 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 da. And so people say, our policy is da, 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 da. They just copy it from the grants guidance. That's not what it's. How do you do it? And particularly procedures are not reiterations, because they should say who's doing what, when, timelines, details, and not who by name, who by position. Okay? So I come into an organization, procedures, if they're good, should really help me to pick up where anybody left off and say, aha, this is my role. This is who I send it to next to review this. So let's see what the law says. Again, it's in the 200, 302, and specifically B7 says what we just said. So you know we're not making it up. That their procedure should be a step-by-step process. That should say are not. Somebody copied that really badly. Rather, the procedures are a step-by-step process used to obtain the goal, the steps that are needed, that are necessary to be in compliance with the federal requirement. We've provided some sample policies. Some are from other states. Some have been looked at by some attorneys, and some we've worked with CDE on, and they're in our booklet. The caution on that is that you ensure, that's always the problem with a template, that you kind of just copy it, but you need to say, make it specific to how does this work. We tried to address the what, but you need to include the how in there. So here's a list of some of the required policies and procedures. We'll take a look at some of them today. Cash management is a big one, requires, and it's beyond the federal cash management. There's a lot involved in cash management. Allowability, that's one that I think sometimes gets lost. How do you determine the allowability of cost? Procurement, as I said, is huge, and that's usually maintained in the fiscal area, but just a reminder that your program people need to understand it too. I just note for procurement that many of you districts work with private schools, and they need to follow your procurement procedures. So that's important for those working with those private schools to know about that. Equipment management, procedures and policies on that. How are you meeting those requirements? Conducting proposals and selecting recipients when you have to go to bid. Time and effort reporting now requires policies and procedures. That was new in the 2015 update. Travel and conflict of interest are two other areas so these are just a smattering of some of the policies and procedures required in the grants guidance. So we'll look at this section of the code addresses fiscal management, and some of the required policies and procedures are embedded in that big topic of fiscal management. And so that section defines some basic fiscal requirements like identification of awards in your accounts, disclosure of your financial, like how you have to report, what records you need to maintain, control over and accountability for property, and then comparison of budgets and expenditures. And then the last two fall into the procedures area under fiscal management. So in this area, you have cash management procedures and allowability procedures. Let's just take a look at federal cash management. So requires you to have cash management procedures. And then formula grants, again, are allocated on a predetermined schedule, but you may have your own policy, again, for drawdowns of discretionary grants. So if you, for a formula grants, it comes through cash management, you spend the money, you have to have reporting, and you should describe how that takes place. But if you have grants that are on a reimbursement schedule, how's that done? Who does it? Who takes care of that? The cash balances, your interest earned reports, who does that? How does that take place? And then your interest earned, we mentioned you can't, you have to report that. So that needs to be remitted. Who does those things? How does that take place? And the next slide we'll see from the standards document, listed are some sample questions to address. Next slide. There we are. Some sample questions that to address when you're considering developing your procedures. So, and there's section for one, this is just on purchase orders and for goods or services, but there's multiple sections. And this is a sample from the Wisconsin Department of Education. And we like it because it doesn't give you what to say, but it gives you the questions to ask, which I think is maybe more helpful. So when you're looking at developing procedures relative to purchase orders, then who has authority to generate a purchase order? Where do those come from? How do they start? How is a purchase order generated? Do you have procedures in place how that works? And what are the steps involved? Once it's generated, then what? And then who approves them? What's the approval process for your orders? Who has the authority to approve contracts? Okay, this is a big one. When contracts, do you have a contracts department? Who do we go to? Who determines if a purchase is allowed on an allowed cost on a federal grant? This sort of, I want to say, smush over into the other area we'll look at, and that's allowability. So how is allowability determined? What's your process? Does someone just say yes, no? Do you have a big fight in the restroom or something? How do you figure it out if it's allowed? All right. What information is used to make the determination if it's an allowable cost? So what's your criteria? What do you use? Which saves so much trouble on the back end when people disagree. Who verifies that goods or services have been budgeted on the federal grant? How do you know it's in the budget? How do all those pieces, these are things you're doing every day, but if someone came in new, how would they know what your procedures are and how to follow that? So as I mentioned, some of those are closely related to allowability. And allowability is one that we sometimes don't see as clearly articulated as it might be. And I think it causes some challenges down the line. Allowability procedures really cross over between program and fiscal. This is really an intersect where that sort of Venn diagram center part is. First of all, your allowability procedures have to address the federal cost principles that we talked about yesterday. Reasonable, necessary, allocable, treated consistently, all those things that are required as listed there. Who reviews your proposed costs to make sure they meet all the federal cost principles? And we said that's a first cut. On the next slide, I believe the Wisconsin guidance gives you some questions to think about when you're developing allowability procedures. So first of all, for each federal program, who develops the budget? Is that someone in the program office? Who has authority to develop that budget? And then who enters the budget? So does that go over to the fiscal office? How does that work? Is that an automatic thing? Do you sit down? Do you meet? Who verifies the budget aligns with the ledger? And how's that communicated between the two program areas? And I know for our program folks, one of the things they always ask for in a review is the general ledger. And what's that? It's the secret thing that's over in the fiscal office. But their budget needs to align there. And if it doesn't, they're going to look at that in a review. Who verifies allowability of a cost under each federal program and the Uniform Grants Guidance? So your program people may be more familiar with the grants guidance, with the federal program requirements, sorry, but who's familiar with the grant guidance requirements and who takes that cut? So how is it verified and who does it? And is it all put on one person, or is that a group? Are there multiple people involved? Who's the informed contact for that'd be the state superintendent? The state superintendent has questions. Is it a hot potato? Nobody, I don't want it. Who is it that's a responsible party for responding to questions? And then when changes occur in the program, who gets notified? And this is really challenging, because sometimes memos come down from CDE, and who's the contact and who does it go to, and does that contact person know other people might need to know? I know we all depend on the superintendent's secretary to get us that information when it lands there, because most things go to the superintendent. But how does the office know the superintendent's office know how to distribute that? And is that in your procedures? And next we will look at some sample. I think we just look, questions to ask, some more questions to ask about allowability. Okay, when cost changes are identified, what's the timeline for submitting a budget amendment? So do you have a set timeline, and is that put up in your, and how's it communicated between program and fiscal offices? Who verifies allowability if you have an amended cost? Does it go back through the same process? Is there a different process if something changes? Who's responsible for generating the documentation to demonstrate a cost is reasonable, necessary, or allocable? And where's that documentation kept? And then where's correspondence regarding budget reviews and that DPI? This is because we stole this from another state. That would be the state superintendent. So any reviews, budget documentation for your federal grants, who keeps that information? And that's going to be important right now, because with the consolidated application, someone is going to need to know who has that fiscal information on federal grants. We're going to need it. And how's all that communicated? The next one is we pulled because it talks about allowability for multiple cost objectives, and we'll touch on those a little bit later. But if you have an employee who's budgeted for multiple program sources, how is that staff? How's it determined how much is funded? We talked about that yesterday, that can be problematic, that you have a change, or a person isn't acting within their original job description, and now they're still funded in that way. Well, what happens? Do you change the funding source? Do you change the work that they're doing? How does all that happen? What documentation? What's the process to use to support that? So how do you decide that you need to make a change? And how's that reviewed? How often? Is there a process for reviewing multi-funded people to make sure they're still on target? And then is there someone who verifies that the charge amounts against the supporting documentation prior to a claim being made? So, and one question here comes in time and effort reports. Who's reviewing those time and effort reports to ensure that multi-funded people are actually working according to their allocated budgeted allocations? Yeah. So procurement, as I said, that's another big area, and that is so big. In most cases, I'm guessing it probably takes a whole book to have your procurement policies and procedures in time. But you can see all the things that are involved. Who does procurement? Who does purchasing? What about contractors? How is that done? We're going to look at conflict of interest a little bit later, but conflict of interest, how do you ensure that doesn't come into your procurement process? So somebody isn't funneling money to, to Brother Joe or something for all the contracts. So what are your procedures? What's your procedures? We talked yesterday about not having duplicative or unnecessary purchases. Well, that should be in your procedures. What do? We have a purchase, particularly for equipment. How do we check to see we don't have duplicates of that we don't need to buy new items? And then documents, including your rationale for contracts. Okay, so contracts can be a big ticket item, and how are you documenting that that contractor is the right contractor. And then how are you following methods for your different kinds of purchases, small purchases? What's your bid process? What's your policy on sole sourcing? And it has to match what's in the uniform guidance. Can't sole source except under certain circumstances. And then proposals, evaluating and selecting them. How does that happen when you go are looking at contracts for bids? And conducting evaluations. So we get some guidance on that from the guidance. We have different types of purchases: micro purchases, small purchases, sealed bids. What are your procedures for each of them? And for competitive proposals, normally you have to have more than one source that submits an offer, and either a fixed price or a cost reimbursement, what type of contract. If you use sealed bids, the conditions are different when you use sealed bids. So that whole bidding process and different purchasing, what's the oversight on that? Right, and competitive proposals, for those that hit the threshold where you have to have a competitive proposal, it has to be publicized, and you have to have a process for evaluating it. It has to be solicited from an adequate number of sources. So what's your written method for conducting evaluations of proposals? How do you decide this, we're going to take this bid over another if it's a competitive bid? Okay, because there may be factors besides just cost that you're considering. You have to show that you're awarding them to a responsible firm who's most advantageous to the program. So what factors are considered when you do that? All right. All right. Conflict of interest is included in the procurement section, and and you'll also find it in some other areas. But conflict of interest, you have to maintain standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest, and then governing the actions for employees if they're engaged in the selection, award, or administration of contracts particularly. So those people who are reviewing and selecting contracts, how do you ensure there's no conflict of interest? So the next slide, we'll see that there are some questions that you might ask when you're writing procedures for conflict of interest. And the first one is, how does the policy or in your procedures include a definition of the relationships that are viewed a conflict of interest? So what would that be? Have you defined it? Number one. And how are employees that are involved in procurement made aware of and given a copy of your conflict of interest policy and procedures? How does that get out to people? Do all employees fill out information regarding relationships that could be viewed as a conflict? Is that important for everyone, or are they selected employees? What's the process for an individual to report a conflict of interest? So I see something, I see a bid, and I go, oh, I feel like I have a conflict here. Who do I go to? What do I do? And then determining a conflict. What's your process for determining that an employee does not have a conflict of interest? Does that come to you? I think this is a conflict. You review it. What are you using? What criteria? Are there regular updates provided to employees, and who reviews the information provided by employees when they think there may be a conflict? Right. So some things to think about in terms of conflict of interest. And also disqualified, who verifies that the employee is removed from participation? You go through the process, but who's the final decider? And what about gratuities? Are they never allowed? Are they sometimes allowed? Is it nominal value? If it's nominal value, what is nominal value? What if it's unsolicited? We've had instances where people get a gift and they don't know what to do. Is that okay? You should have policies and procedures. Disciplinary action, if you don't recuse yourself, and what happens? So, and then reporting. who's responsible to report to the state. Again, that would be the SPI, state superintendent. And when would you report that there is a conflict of interest? So a lot to think about in conflict of interest policies. Okay. All right, property standards, and this we're just going to skip, but these are, again, all the things to think about for equipment, particularly your inventory, what's your procedures for that. You have to every 2 years have a physical inventory. How's that done? Who's done it? Disposal of equipment. All of these pieces are critical. How's your inventory done? Who maintains it? How's it updated? How often? So just one big area probably when you've been dealing with though for some time. So we'll move on to the next area, which requires policies and procedures. And this was new in the 2015 updated guidance. Actually, I mentioned yesterday that there is a section in the cost principles called selected items of cost. And in that section is a section called, it's about personnel, I don't want to say personnel expenses. And the first part of it talks about what you can count for personnel, what kind of, how you can pay, what's allowed, what kind of positions. But this particularly section I is the one that people usually zone in on because it's about the requirements for documenting personnel expenses. And this is what we've always referred to lovingly as kind of time and effort reporting, right? So it starts out by telling us that charges to federal award for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. Okay? So any employee paid with any federal funds needs to report. And the records go on. All of these are the requirements, which essentially give you what needs to be in your procedures for time and effort reporting. So they have to be supported by a system of internal control. Right? They have to be incorporated into your records, which means documentation, which typically is time and effort reporting. They need to reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. So it's not just the federal part of their work, but it's the whole activity that they're paid for. And again, not exceeding 100%. So we know everybody works 120%, but you can only count the 100%. That's your job that you get paid for. It has to include both federally assisted and other activities. So that's why, although state programs and state general fund programs don't require time and effort reporting typically, if you have a multi-funded person who's funded with both federal grant and state funds, it triggers time and effort reporting. Also has to comply with your, and this is where the policies and procedures come in. It needs to comply with established accounting policies and practices of the entity. And this one, reserve, means they never figured out what they were going to put there, and it stayed that way. So we ignore that one. It needs to support your distribution of your salary and wages among activities or cost objectives. So it's you need to show all the different cost objectives you're working under. And the key one, budget estimates alone don't qualify as support. So you can't just do your budget estimates at the beginning of the here's how we're going to fund this person 50-50 or whatever it is, and go forth and do good work. That doesn't work. You've got to have reports, and then you have to reconcile those reports. So these are all, so we heard under the new 5 years ago that, oh, time and effort reporting, no more PARs, no more semi-annuals. Well, when we go through each of these, you see, you end up doing something that looks very much like a PAR or a semi-annual, and you do the same process of reconciling and such. So if you're familiar with the California School Accounting Manual, I would suggest to all of you, program and fiscal, that you even have a copy or have access to Procedure 905, because it's a huge document. Procedure 905 reviews time and effort reporting, and you'll note that the state still uses the term personnel activity reports or PARs and semi-annuals. So that's because when you go through these processes, as much as it sounds like your policy should cover it, in most cases it looks pretty similar. But let's take a little bit better look, because I know people always, this is always an area that people have interest in. All right. So we talked about number one, the need to be supportive of and that provides assurance that charges are properly documented. So currently, if you're using using the current system with PARs, those need to be filed, and so that's internal control, looking to reconcile them. But the question would be, who's reviewing when an employee submits a time and effort report? Who looks at to see if it's reasonable, and then what happens if they don't? So what's your internal control for that? Okay, and let's take a look at the next slide, which I think talks a little more about how that applies. So if you're adequately using the standards for documentation, everything on that list, it kind of triggers and sort of supports internal controls. But also think about, what's going on now, and under the current, the federal Office of Management and Budget did put forth some indicating that LEAs may want to revise their policies and procedures for employees and for time and effort reporting to reflect the current conditions. So are you still to maintain documentation the same way, require it, review it, the way you've always done in the past? And if not, you need to put in some additional procedures for exceptional circumstances in there. So that's where your risk assessment would come in. But those you need to keep in consideration with your time and effort policies. Next, we'll look at time and effort is continued. On the next slide, some internal control questions about specific to time and effort are what are the risks specific to your organization? Okay, do you have a lot of new staff? Well, are they familiar with reporting? Do you have a lot of multi-funded positions? That's going to be something that you'd want to, I'd see as a risk, and that you'd want to put some activity in to support. Okay, do you have new funding source? Is everyone familiar with what's required reporting on it? So, and again, well, as we said, is for review, improving those reports. Information and communication, and we look at what training do you give to employees and supervisors? How do employees know how to fill out a time and effort report, what it means? What do supervisors know about how to review it? What are managers? How are they informed if the duties don't match the activities? Who informs who? We always tell at the site, you should let someone in the central office know so you can decide how to address it. Okay, if the work is what needs to be done, then maybe the budget needs to be changed to reflect it. If that's not, and things just got off track, then you need to bring them back on track and have that person do what they need to do. Monitoring, who compares the reports with your budget estimates? That would be an internal controls piece that's always been there. You have to compare. Is this matching what we estimated, or is it changing? And what's the process in place to determine if funding, if you decide no, this position's totally changed. This year, maybe a lot of things change in terms of funding. So how's that working for you? Who are you talking to? How's that changing? So you make sure that people are paid appropriate for the work that needs to be done. All right. That's the total activity, I believe. Oh, it needs to be incorporated, of course, into the official records. And that, again, it says 3 years, we recommend 5, and the state kind of supports that you have to keep it for audit purposes. All right. All right, next is the total activity. This is on that list that you had. It has to reflect, the report has to reflect the total activity for which they're compensated, not exceeding 100%. Okay, so it specifically says you only report 100%. If someone works over, but that's not part of their compensation, then you don't put those hours, you don't reflect those. And the what is 100%? Okay, it doesn't include your time that they don't get paid for. And if they have additional, what if they have additional response they do get paid for beyond this pay? Well, that kind of depends, because if it's part of their position and you increase their salary amount because you want them to do additional work, then that would be, now that's their 100% that they report on. But if it's a separate position, like a contract, you have a separate contract and that's separate, then each position could be viewed separately. And if they're both federally funded, they both refer to, they both require reporting. And that note about the Montana Compact, that's an unofficial document that was put together by a group of state superintendents with the Office of Management and Budget years ago. But and there's a copy of it in our handbook, and you can also, I'm sure, Google it. And it provides some guidance for things that aren't maybe as clear in the law. So the reports need to include, again, federal and non-federal funds. So this is why state funds can trigger time and effort reporting if you're multi-funding someone with state funds. So that's something to think about. Because sometimes from a fiscal perspective, it looks good to split fund someone, but it's good to back off and think about the ramifications first. And one is, how much work is that going to create for how many people, and how much potential of error or problems. So and just put that into your thinking, because they do have to include all your non-federal funds, which typically they wouldn't have to account for. And some example of a multi-funded position. So if you're funding, and again, that's what we just said, it's required for the full amount of time, both federal and on your unrestricted funds. Then the policies have to comply with your established accounting policies and practices. So again, it's that same idea that we talked about yesterday. You got to treat your federal funds the same as you do your state funds. So whatever procedures and accounting procedures you have, you need to use them uniformly for both state and federal programs. And we've mentioned, and this is where sort of a lot of questions arise, and that has to do with that you need the records that employees provide need to support the distribution of their salary and wages among specific cost objectives. And there was a document put out called Efforts to Ease the Burden several years ago that tried to explain that. But we're going to take a look at that in just a minute. I think before we do, we'll just finish up on these requirements, which has to do with the next one, which is budget estimates. There's a star here because a lot of people seem to get in trouble for this one. And that means that in monitoring, and that is that your budget estimates, you can use them in the interim, of course, but your estimates are estimates. And how the person actually works is how that person actually works. So those are two different things. You estimate a person's going to work 50-50. Well, maybe life changes and they work 75-25. Okay. So what you have to, that budget estimate of 50-50 doesn't qualify to support those charges. Because you budget it doesn't make it true. Okay? The system has to show those estimates actually match what the employee's done. Now, so the budget estimates, you use them to make approximations, and but significant changes of work need to be entered into the records, and all it says is in a timely manner. The old guidance told you it had to be a specific time. Here it's saying 1 or 2 short fluctuations. You don't need to do immediately, but long term it needs to add up. So you need to reconcile those numbers. And reconciliation, that's your system. Again, it's an internal control system. It's a process to review after the fact interim changes and then make adjustments, okay? Sally was supposed to work this percentage in Title I and this in Title III, and it turned out there was a greater need in Title III, so we moved her over there. Therefore, her time and effort report should reflect that, and therefore we need to adjust the amount of money going to support her salary in each of those areas. And Yeah, it is a common finding, and for some reason. So again, what are your internal controls? And CSAM procedure 905 provides some support in how those should be done. And they talk about monthly comparisons of monthly reports should be done at least quarterly. And then they're saying if a variance of more than 10% occurs, then it should be adjusted on a quarterly basis. So that's state guidance. So I would suggest you look at procedure 905. All right, our bottom, okay. If you get it right, you're done, right? If you do everything right and all those and everything's perfect, you're done. But if the records don't meet the standards of that section, okay, if it doesn't work, then this applies to with certain exceptions. Then the next slide, I think, will tell you what you need to do, and that is you may require personnel activity reports, which is why many people say, I think I'll just do them in the first place, okay? So if something goes wrong and you're using a different system, you could be required to revert back to PARS if you're not using that system. So I think we just walked all the way around the circle, which is why most people are still using PARS and semi-annuals. All right. Okay, just a few other things to remember about salaries and wages. You can't use them to meet matching requirements. And it's the same as you saw yesterday, that you can't match, you can't meet a matching requirements with state and local funds. So if you have a match required, it's got to be, I'm sorry, you have to use state and local funds. You can't use a match from federal funds to meet a matching requirement for federal requirements. Okay. And let's, yeah, if you get a grant that requires, this says it more clearly than I did, so I'm glad that slide was there. Yeah, if you receive a federal grant, requires a match, then the match is based on, and if you're using employee salaries, then that would trigger time and effort reporting. Okay, so that's kind of a different one. So typically you have a state general fund employee and 100% whatever, LCFF, general fund, no problem, no time and effort required. But you receive a grant that requires a match and you go, hey, we could use Harry's salary as a match because it meets criteria. If you do that, then Harry has to do time and effort reporting. Okay, so it triggers time and effort reporting if you use state funds for a match. Okay, but you can't just use a state-funded employee typically, or maybe a federal employee. It would have to be a state-funded employee, but then it triggers time and effort even if they're not paid with a penny of federal money. So think about that if you use personnel for a match. And now we're back to cost objectives, okay? So here's this statement that's in the documentation about that you have to, that your documentation has to support the distribution of employees' salary and wages among specific activities or cost objectives. So we want to take just a moment at the very end of the day, which is the best time to hit the worst topic, but just to kind of take a moment and delve into cost objectives. So let's look at the definition. And well, let's look at why it's important. Okay, we'll look at that first. And why it's important is because that's what it says in the law, that it's based on these cost objectives. So we need to know what they are. And the reason it's confusing is that a cost objective is not necessarily synonymous with a program. So Title I is not a cost objective. It seemed like it, but it's not, okay? Because there are multiple cost objectives within some programs like Title I. And correctly identifying the cost objective makes sure that your reports are more completed more effectively, and it can help in some cases with your more efficient reporting. So what is a cost objective? And it's defined for us. How nice. It's defined right in the regulations. It's a program, function, activity, award, organizational, subdivision, contract, or work unit for which cost data are desired and for which provision is made to accumulate and measure the cost of processes, products, jobs, capital projects, etc. Maybe that didn't help. okay? But it does make sense if you parse it out a bit. So let's look at how we might put it simply. It's a cost that you need to keep track of or account for. You need to track that particular cost. That's a cost objective. It can be a Title I school-wide program is considered a cost objective. However, there are pieces within that that you may have to track. So an activity within a program, Title I has a parent involvement reservation requirement. You have to reserve 1%. In order to prove that, you have to track that. If that involves personnel, then it would be a cost objective and would need documentation. A function within a program. We had a good question yesterday about function. A function is what someone does. So Joe may do multiple things. Joe may coach at a school site, but then Joe may also do some administrative work. Those are two different functions. So if you have a Title I administrator, okay, they're administering the program, it's still Title I, right? But administration is capped at 15%, so you have to track it. So Title I administration is a cost objective. An award, specialized secondary programs, example, if it still exists, okay? If you get a particular award, that is a cost objective. Or an activity funded with multiple funding sources that benefits each program. Each program within there is a cost objective. So it means you have to track it. That's what a cost objective is. All right. Let's look at so we have two options, a single cost objective. And that is what would typically allow you to use a semi-annual certification, which is why we like single cost objectives, right? It's a set of work activities that can be considered a single cost objective. And the criteria here is important to keep in mind. Two things have to be in place. The service that individual is performing and the population that is being served, it is allowable under either of the programs supporting the cost objective. So if you could pay that employee 100% with either one of the funding sources, and it would be totally legitimate because the work they're doing meets with the grant requirements, the plans, whatever it is, they're in line, but you could also do them 100% with the other funding source, then you can count them as a single cost objective because essentially they're doing the same work for the same kids, all right? So that's your test. And I think the next one says the test, but that was the test. Okay, can your salary and wages be supported 100% from each of the awards, or from the federal award alone? So you could fund it just from the federal award if it's paid from non-federal funds. So look if you can see if that person. So if you're supporting a person, the second example is if you're paying with general funds and a federal program, then you would have to say that it would be allowable to pay that whole salary with the federal funded piece. And here's an example where someone got in trouble with that. They had a Title I, Title III, which is really hard to do. It's really because Title III is so tight. But they had a Title I, Title III multi-funded person, and everything was, and reviewers said, actually, it's the same kids, it fits, it's with your school plans, everything's working. But then they ended up doing some testing, required testing, the LCAP testing, which was in CELT maybe, for students, which is a general funded activity, and it threw it out of the single cost objective required to reportings because they did something that you couldn't pay for with either of those other federal funding sources. So that's how you can get in trouble with it, but the test is kind of easy. All right, so it's multiple funding sources, and multiple funding sources can be considered a single cost objective. And again, if the activity and the population, so it's two key areas. Let's look at an example. And we have coaches. They're providing professional development to teachers at Title I schools to support intervention to close achievement gaps. Okay, so this is funded, and they funded it with Title I and Title II. So the question is, could that be supported 100% with Title I funds? Okay. Could a school decide, Or from a district reservation, we're going to put coaches in our Title I schools. Sounds like you could do that. That's a Title I because they're working with Title I students, and they're also doing activities that support professional development to close achievement gaps. Very Title I-ish. How about Title II? Title II's professional development, broad for all students. However, there is a focus on high poverty schools. Sounds like you could do that also with Title II funds. So it could be supported from either funding source. So this could be an instance where you have two funding sources and you have a single cost objective. So this person could do a semi-annual report. All right, next slide. Yeah, just a couple things. ESEA, I mentioned consolidated administrative funds. I'd refer you to the CSAM section to look more at that. But in the consolidated application, you can check a box and say your administrators can work on selected federal programs, and they can bind them and treat them as a single cost objective for time and effort reporting. The issue people have, and the reason they don't use it, is because most administrators do more than just federal programs. They end up doing some general fund things too, so it usually doesn't work. And federal law allows for school-wide programs to be a single cost objective. However, it's still reviewed, the actual costs are still reviewed to make sure they're allowable. All right, next we'll look at multiple funding sources, multiple cost objectives. Again, works on one or more award, and the activities performed are allowable from each funding source. No, activity works on more than one award, and the activities are allowable 100%. It may be considered a single cost objective. We're going to check this slide before we post it, all right? Let's move. It's 4:32. Let's move to the next one. We only have a few more. All right, so here's some examples. An instructional assistant works every day in a reading lab at a Title I school, and they're assisting EL students and which could at-risk students, which could include English learners. So this could be paid 100% from Title I school at-risk students, but it couldn't be paid from Title III because it's not specifically focused on English learners. It may include some English learners, and Title I can certainly include them, but Title III is specific to English learners, not a single cost objective. Let's take a look at another one. Okay, single funding sources is what we've said before. All right, next one. Multiple cost objectives are within Title I. We mentioned that we have direct services. Remember yesterday we talked about direct services and administrative costs. And direct services are from school allocations and allowable reservations. Those are all direct services, but your reservations all need to be direct services too. But then you have administrative costs. So administrative costs definitely are a separate cost objective. Your parent involvement needs to be tracked. That's a separate cost objective. So your reservations need to be tracked. So you can see Title I has a lot of pieces to it, which is why you have to be careful with determining if what cost objective you're looking at. All right, what's next? Okay, we have a resource teacher working 4.5 days a week. They're providing reading instruction in Title I schools, but half the day a week, the district office pulls this person in to help with administration. And again, this is not a single cost objective because they're providing direct instruction, but the administrative costs are separate cost objectives. So you would have to split multi-fund that person, and you would have to track those. And that would, if you're using the previous system, that would be personnel activity report. All right. I think we have one more. Okay. So policy procedures is huge. It is foundational to the grants guidance and to internal controls. But the takeaway just to look at of the policies and procedures we talked about, do you already have in place, and are both your parts of the office, the fiscal and program administrators, involved in developing those policies? And because sometimes one side or the other has something to add that you might not think of on the other side, revising those policies and procedures, making sure they're really working. And how do employees, how are they aware of them? How do you make sure everyone knows their piece in ensuring that procedures are followed? So, and remember, a big reminder that a focus of the grants guidance is your responsibility. And so it's not external. If you have it written in your policies and procedures, then you can be found out of compliance for not following your own procedures. It's not somebody else said that you had to do it their way. You said this is how we do it, but people aren't doing it. You're in violation of federal requirements. That's why number 3 there is so important, making everyone aware of what those procedures are. All right, well, today we came as close as ever to 6 minutes over. Okay, so we've been short, we've been long, and we've been almost on time. We really appreciate having you with us. We're going to let you go, and we'll take a look at any questions that might be there and get back to you. But we're always around. Please shoot us an email if you have any questions. And we love putting our heads together and responding to those. So thank you so much for being with us. We'll leave it open for just a few minutes in case there's any question. Good, there are some questions. We will be getting that back out to you. So take care. It's been a pleasure having you with us.